So I think that everybody is slowly coming in from the coffee. And since we have a very packed program, I think we should start and see who else joins us. So welcome everybody at this final session of the day, and I can imagine that a lot of energy is already drained after such a long day. Still, I hope you have some left to dive with us into a very important topic: trustworthy repositories and data sovereignty. My name is Ingrid Dillo and I work at DANS, which is a repository in the Netherlands. And I think that our topic does not need a lot of introduction, fortunately, because already yesterday and also today, the topic of data governance, data sovereignty, was mentioned many times and introduced by several speakers. For example, Marc Lemaitre said yesterday that data sovereignty is not a nice to have in Europe at the moment, but it is a necessity. And he also said that the EOSC turns data sovereignty into practice if all goes well. Also about a month ago, even the European Parliament dove into the topic of data sovereignty. They organized a workshop, and at that workshop they stated that, well, there is a worry based on the geopolitical changes that we see in the world, but also the fact that there is a lot of commercial interest involved when it comes to important databases that researchers are dependent on around the world and in Europe. So at that workshop of the European Parliament, there was the, I think she is the chief negotiator for Horizon Europe, Signe Razzo, and she again also stated that data sovereignty is an essential element of our research and innovation agenda in Europe. And Klaus Tochterman, the president of the EOSC Association, who was there as well in the panel and who is in the room, continued on that topic and again also stated that the EOSC is the infrastructure that will provide such a trustworthy environment. So we see that the topic is in the center of political interest, and today we are going to explore what the crucial role is of trustworthy digital repositories in the creation of that EOSC as a safe place for our data. So, after having said that, I can tell you that we will start with a number of short presentations to explore that role of repositories, but to also look at approaches to strengthen data sovereignty. And we will also have two people from repositories that really talk about their personal experience in this area. And after that, there is time for a panel discussion. And of course, then you also have the opportunity via Slido to come up with questions that you might have, and you can also prioritize questions. But we will also take some questions right here in the room. I think we are with a relatively small number of people and it's not online, so I think that is a nice way to approach that. I've said enough. It's high time for our first speaker, Jan Meijer. And Jan is Senior Advisor at the Norwegian Agency for Shared Services in Education and Research, ZICT in short. And he will talk about trustworthy repositories as a pillar of data sovereignty. And with that, I think it's the presentation that will set the scene.
Yep.
The floor is
Thank you,
yours.
Ingrid. I have 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, and
yep.
I'm going to...
And you're going to monitor that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. So I am not a trustworthy data repository expert, just to have said that. But I have dabbled a lot in digital sovereignty and infrastructures and whatnot. So I'm going to try to introduce the topic. Sovereignty, right? A key principle that, that guides relations between countries in our planet, right? That is where it all boils down to, the complete power to govern a country. And in the real space, this concept has been around for hundreds of years, and it's a very simple concept. You have a chunk of area, and if you want to be sovereign over that, you prevent other people from entering that chunk of area, and then it's your rules that count. Still the same principle. Weaponry is a bit more modern, but your country, your rules, you decide. Doesn't matter what kind of governance you have, democracy, dictatorship, your rules, your country. So it was quite logical when the digital world came around to kind of like apply the same concept on that digital world. Your country, your digital destiny. And a subset of that digital sovereignty would then be data sovereignty, data generated within your borders, governed by your laws and your regulatory frameworks. Right? Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, because with the physical sovereignty, you just put someone at the border with a big gun, and that's the end of that. No more invasions, no more sovereignty threats. Here you don't have to physically rock up to where the data is. And I think that is where things become complicated, because they become much more mixed. So why does this matter? When deletion of scientific data hits the BBC news site, then you know that this is starting to become interesting for the public eye. So this is just one article. I could have taken many more. Trump comes in, climate data gets started to be deleted, data gets rescued. In between here, I could slot an in-between allotment from the Norwegian government to our national data service in Norway to basically fund that data rescue initiative. And I'm aware of many similar initiatives that have happened in other countries. Right? So across the board, money is now being invested to rescue data, which we thought was secure, but it turned out that we have been naive. Our friends turned out to be less friendly than they were supposed to be. In an age where we have research-driven policy making, think back to what happened in COVID, right? All those simulations on what happens with certain measures, they're data-driven. If we cannot access certain pieces of data, then that is definitely a threat to our data sovereignty. If we store data in places where we cannot be sure that what comes in goes out, what goes in comes out, that threatens our data sovereignty. So, income, TDRs, Trustworthy Data Repositories, they preserve digital objects. I'm not going to read through all of that. There is a lot of time and effort spent on doing that job properly, defining all sorts of policies to make sure that over time these digital objects are preserved and are still accessible, or, in other words, governed by a nation's laws and regulatory frameworks. And so this is where kind of like the two come together. There are, however, some challenges with that. Data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, it's not a binary thing. It's not like there is a nice clean-cut definition. If you do things like this and like that, then you're certified data sovereign. And that's a quite complicated problem. Is your data sovereign if you store it on an American hyperscaler? Now that's a really good question, and there has been a lot of debate about that. The hyperscalers say yes. Other people in France, for example, say no. From time to time you see some anecdotal evidence that says, probably not. The case was yesterday referred to of one of the prosecutors at the International Crime Court who saw his access to Microsoft being deleted. There have been similar cases like that. The hyperscalers are now deploying sovereign data centers. So the question is still out. I tried to plow through a bit of the research on this. The good news is there is a lot of research going on, but there is no clear-cut definition. So seems to boil down to a risk management exercise. It's a grayscale. The other problem that we're facing in Europe is we don't have one sovereignty layer. It's not the case that you can say European sovereign is going to be good enough, because we're not the United States of Europe. Right? It's a loose, not even a federation of nations. So we have always to take into account two levels of sovereignty. You have your national sovereignty, you have the European sovereignty. Sometimes it's enough with the European sovereignty, but at the end of the day, if as a country you're investing billions of euros in particular research, do you really want to rely on the friendliness of your neighboring European state to always protect that? And always is a very long term. And if you look at how geopolitics is evolving in Europe, then you can see that some countries in that respect are probably more reliable than others. And that's going to be a shifting balance. And it might be politics, might be ideology driven, it might be money driven. Case in point, the Dutch government that collapsed a couple of months ago, one of their policy initiatives was, I think, to cut research funding with, what was it, 30%? 20%? A lot. So that has consequences for storing the data in the Netherlands. As a wider community, where TDRs then come in, right? There are, I think I counted, Ingrid, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's something like 60 or 80 Core Trust Seal certified repositories in Europe. And they're scattered all over the continent, and probably more on the way. So as a collective in Europe, on the map, we do have quite a bit to play with in terms of good organizations that spend a lot of time making sure that what goes in must come out over time. So trustworthy digital repositories are in the business of preserving digital objects over time. And data sovereignty says that data would be governed by a nation's laws and regulatory frameworks. And there's your third challenge. And I'm paraphrasing. Where are you, Hervé? Ah, there. Yeah, all the words in those sentences, both in the TDRs and the data sovereignty, are ambiguous, disputed, or subject to debate. And unfortunately, that is the state of things. Now, fortunately, we do have initiatives to navigate this landscape. The trustworthy data repositories are talking to each other, are working together, currently in projects Fidelis, Eden, working on building a network so that we can navigate these challenges together over time as our understanding improves, working on technical policy harmonization, implementation of regulations harmonization, technical capabilities, and not in the least training and support. And with a bit of luck, that is going to make TDRs pillars of digital sovereignty for research data. And I think this is where I'm going to hand over, nicely within time. It is.
Thanks very much, Jan. Next speaker is Hervé Loes, who will dive deeper into the approaches to strengthen data sovereignty within repositories. And Hervé is Associate Director at the UK Data Archive, University of Essex. Hervé, take the floor.
Hi everyone, thanks to Jan for setting the stage. There'll be another good bit after me, so this won't last forever, it'll be fine. Okay. So following on from that ambiguity, a lot of this work that's going on is about disambiguating some of these terms. So we've got areas that differentiate repositories from archives. The EOSC handbook looks at databases. The term repositories can exclude registries, even though we depend on those quite strongly. But all of these can be considered as venues, and this, to an extent, includes those future EOSC nodes, where a researcher might interact with a digital object. They're organizations responsible for catalogs listing digital objects. There's a data versus digital objects question here. A lot of the work will be on raw and processed data for researchers, but the Fidelis coverage, which is the other project that was just mentioned here, is all digital objects held by repositories, software, workflows, ontologies, semantic artifacts. The next question here is about preservation and the level of care that you see applied to those objects. We know from prior experience that preservation is used to refer to everything from basic storage and integrity and access, right through to full disciplinary specific data and metadata, assurances of usability and semantically understandable fair over time services. So we need to look a little bit beyond the repositories, or beyond the term repositories, as a dependency for a federated sovereignty approach. So any venue where a researcher or curator interacts with a digital object or its metadata. Whether it's a repository, an archive, or a database, there are huge dependencies on registries. And obviously, in the terms of the Fidelis project and network, this has got a great influence on future membership and future stakeholders. But this is just 13 of the list of things that we've plowed through to work towards some of the solutions we're looking at today. And the realization at the moment is it really is down to the fact that transparency is a basis for trust, and we've got a very broad criteria landscape here to look at. We've got an increasing number of criteria from OAS to core to NDSA. Some of those allow us to do assessments, things like ISO, DIN, and Core Trust Seal. But there are also multiple authorities claiming control over what could be trustworthy repository status, not just Core Trust Seal, but the European Open Science Cloud work for the nodes, the handbook, and for the EC as well. So it's a pretty complex landscape. And as Jan's outlined, there isn't clarity on sovereignty, even though we're having this conversation here today. So trust is not binary, transparency is the foundation, and similarly for sovereignty, there's no legal formal definition, there's no authority for those criteria, there's no mechanism for assessment. We've got a clear overlap with trust, but there are similar challenges. And a lot of these that we've worked through, we're moving from generally desirable goals to more specific, clear, and measurable outcomes, and moving from prose documentation into kind of machine actionable, testable metadata. So this is transparent information as evidence of compliance, and machine actionability where possible, but vitally, including where we need that human expertise throughout. So a lot of the work we're doing on the project is about answering the question, can I, as a researcher, deposit this object in this repository, and be confident it will be cared for in a way that ensures that another researcher can understand and use it. And we keep that as a central goal of what we're looking at. So trust and sovereignty are now both factors in picking the right repository for the right objects. So in terms of solutions, I'll briefly look at the analysis and understanding methodology we're deploying through Fidelis, a thing called the Transparent Trustworthy Repository Attributes Matrix. But that doesn't work on its own, and as usual, this ends up being a situation of breaking the problem down into its more manageable chunks, data, technical, and operational sovereignty, and making sure that we communicate and clarify across the board so we can specify, align, implement, and then maintain a sovereign environment. So this TTRAN thing, it looks at a bunch of common activities and functions, it maps them to existing criteria and metadata, looks at those different levels of care, and looks a little bit beyond the types of repository that we're used to, so I'll get to those. So we've got 30 activities and functions, they're relatively constant across all repositories. We look at how these functions are influenced by different repository variables, because this all helps us identify what information needs to be made transparent. Without transparency, we can't have a network, we can't have assessment, we can't have cooperation. It's that transparent information. So in some contexts, these factors will influence trust and trustworthiness, but defining those contexts in a clear way is one of the fundamental challenges that we've got. So the TTRAN is being used within Fidelis for collecting information, understanding the different types of repositories in a little bit more detail, sharing some of that structured information, and then designing and implementing the network. And I think that it's got a use case for some of the sovereignty issues as well. So as I said, we've taken these activities and functions, we're looking at the levels of retention, curation and preservation offered by repositories, and then drilling down to some of the repository, object, user and depositor characteristics that influence what we do. The first of these came originally out of the Core Trust Seal's desire to clarify who was in scope. So this moves repositories up from retention only, just assuring that these things remain available for a defined period of time, to setting deposit compliance measures at the entrance point for the repository, whether human-mediated or automated, sometimes taking initial curation measures to make sure we meet some of the criteria we've got, and then A there is active preservation, taking that explicit long-term responsibility for assuring that understandability and usability are maintained. Fair plus time, as someone mentioned earlier today. And the second big variable that we've got to look at across what the repository is expected to do is the typology. So we're moving from that into the categories here. Institutional, regional, generalist, and disciplinary repositories, they're not going away, and those terms aren't going away. But we've worked out through the work we've done so far that we really need to look at the digital object types, the range of users served, the range of depositors served, and how those influence the skills that the repository needs. And you can see that the user, depositor, and object factors will influence sovereignty over time as well. These activities are all broadly divided into things which are fairly familiar for trusted repositories: digital object management, organizational infrastructure, technology, and security. This is intended to map and complement existing work and to work on getting more granular mapping so we can all understand where we're coming from. It's very much a cooperative mapping exercise, not a replacement for what exists. So we've got that methodology that we're using. Yeah, there'll be more coming out of the project on that. In terms of cooperation and engagement, we can look to define the sovereignty criteria, the different authorities who are claiming to be able to tell us what counts, and the evidence as well. Essentially, we'll be looking at overlaps with existing criteria and bringing together interested parties so we can develop common expectations and essentially an authority model to make sure that we handle any possible disagreement. This is going to be covering data at an individual object level, including kind of like data sovereignty for individuals. Operational control and the rights and responsibilities we see there, and as Jan's mentioned already, some of this technical infrastructure that we'd like to have control over in one way or another. So as with the rest of this TTRAN work, we're looking to align with existing standards and examine new variables that influence transparency, technology, responsibility, user focus, sovereignty in this case. So again, to reflect Jan, trust is not a binary thing. We need to define the specific contexts quite explicitly. They depend on understanding the objects, the actors, the roles, and the expected level of service that we see attached to those objects. And they need to be based on reliable, transparent information. We've already looked at a variety of different people who are claiming responsibility over here. The EC Annotated Grant Agreement sets expectations, as does the EOSC Handbook, as does the Core Trust Seal, just over trust status. Yeah? So they've got widely different requirements, and then we might have more specific requirements through, say, something like CESDA or through Elixir for the disciplinary expectations as well. This is a broad range of things that our repositories are expected to do. So we know that this is not a single binary outcome, but as we said, there are a number of grey areas across this wide list of activities and functions. Okay? So we're going to break this down over the course of a period of time, but hopefully these will be familiar to a lot of these sovereignty issues. We're underlying this with security. Where is the data? Who's got control of it? Storage integrity? Who runs your technical infrastructure? We can't ignore those organizational infrastructure measures where governance and the criteria also include handling the rights management in a machine actionable and explicit and standard way across a federated EOSC. And finally, we've got that life cycle from the conception right through to reuse. We need to handle exactly what's being done where and making sure that we align with the necessary expectations of data sovereignty throughout in terms of object control, technology, and operations. We've got multiple intervention points that we can look at, something else that Jan's mentioned just before, and this is how those levels pull together to deliver transparent information against each of those variables which we've shared to date. One last point is that the core preservation processes which the Eden project are developing are being mapped here into the life cycle, and we know that we can develop heat maps between this variety of different expectations, yeah, and where this central TTRAN model comes in. So what we're looking to do is integrate the expectations of sovereignty and move out to deliver a clear expectation management and clarity mapped to a bunch of existing standards. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Hervé. I'm getting a little worried because I don't see any questions appearing in Slido, and this was a very dense presentation with a lot of information, so please, if you have any questions, put them in Slido. And I don't know, did we get the code for the Slido up? Is there still somebody who doesn't know where to find it? There it is. Okay, and when you think about your questions based on the first two presentations, I'm here to introduce our third speaker, Robert Huber, who will speak from his personal experiences at the Pangea repository. Robert is a geologist and information specialist, and Pangea is part of Bremen University. Robert?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to Pangea, and as a best practice example. Pangea is an information system for long-term archival and publication of scientific data, and here we're focusing on Earth system related data, so this is basically data from the Earth and environmental sciences, and we have a particular focus on such data from the marine realm. The system, or the Pangea, was established about 30 years ago, and it is hosted actually by two institutions. First, the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, also Germany, and the MARUM, which is a research institute of the University of Bremen. The name Pangaea comes from the supercontinent, actually. This is also somehow, based on the Alfred Wegener invention of that name, so it brings some historical context here. The data Pangaea hold is very heterogeneous and multidisciplinary. We have, of course, data from the Earth system, such as here geophysical data, as shown here, this transect, as well as biological observation data. But the majority of our data is typically here, for example, time series observations over the time, or observations here across transects, or vertical measurements on the water column or the atmosphere, and so on. Currently, we host more than 440,000 data sets, and these data sets comprise of more than 35 billion individual measurements or observations. The data origins from more than 900 research projects. 30 years is a long time. These projects are European projects, national German projects, but also international projects. And, a large amount of data is here submitted by individual scientists. The increase is also quite significant. We receive about 10,000 data sets, new data sets per year. And, so this is ongoing. The team is, very motivated. I make it a little bit shorter. We have, of course, a motivated team of editors, technical team, management, and, project managers. I mentioned that. Important to know is that in addition to the two hosting institutions, we have contractual agreement with a number of other institutions which actually hire their own data curators and editors and are allowed to use our system. So these people are trained by our team, and they directly ingest their data from their institutions to Pangaea. So this is the submission and publication workflow from Pangaea. Submission is handled by our own system, which is supported by a ticket system. And after initial review of that data set, if it is accepted, this is then passed to editorial processing workflow, which is here guided by a dedicated editor or data curator. This is actually the interesting part, because here the metadata is completed in an iterative process with the submitting scientists, and data is quality checked here. So after that process, the data is minted by a DOI and then made available here via the Pangaea website, and other tools like the data warehouse, APIs, and so on. So it's available then for the scientific community. A typical Pangaea data set looks like this. So actually, the priority data type we care most, or no, we don't care most, but this is actually the data sets which makes Pangaea special, is tabular data. So we curate this data down to the data item level. So every individual measurement is then transferred to our relational system. And so this requires, of course, a very high degree of curation, standardization, harmonization, for example, to use internal and external vocabularies to harmonize variable names, methods, devices, and so on. But this data item management of the data makes this data analysis ready, right? That's easy to be embedded in data analytic workflows. And to support this, we have, for example, this Pangaea Python library, which makes it really easy to use Pangaea data in workflow systems. We heard today several times that trust comes with time, and Pangaea was founded in the 80s actually as a rock core, sediment core repository, very specific, and it evolved into what it is now, this multidisciplinary open system during the 90s, and with respect to trustworthiness, we received our accreditation from the International Council of Science as a World Data System in 2001 already. 6 years later, we received an accreditation from the World Meteorological Organization as a World Radiation Monitoring Center. So we have a specialized data curator for that kind of data. And since 2019, we have a core trust seal, which was recently renewed. I think that was the second time or so. So this is something we cared about and still care about a lot to demonstrate also trustworthiness to the community. So with respect to data sovereignty, we are trying to minimize dependencies in general. So the hosting of the data is managed in-house. The majority of data is hosted by the Alfred Wegener Institute as part of the Helmholtz infrastructure. So with respect to that, we are almost autonomous. We rely heavily on open source software, and in addition to this, the majority of the software we use, the tools and services, are in-house solutions. So this has been developed by our own developers. So of course, also again to avoid dependencies. Important with respect to sovereignty is also, of course, some kind of financial independence. We have a long-term commitment of our hosting institutions. I mentioned that already. This is has been manifested as a contract, the AMA contract, which regulates things and responsibilities. This is accompanied by a business funding model. I mentioned that before, that we are doing project-related data management, which of course also generates additional funding sources. So as a trustworthy repository, so you can also serve as a safe harbor for others. And during the last years, we performed data rescue activities for smaller data archives, databases, or for example, data which has been published as CD-ROM collections in the 90s mainly. These orphaned data have been transferred to Pangaea, and well, so we had some experience in that, but still we were surprised when we have seen the news from the US that parts of the climate-related data and what was also interesting for us, geophysical data, is about to disappear soon. So we joined this data rescue activity and took over responsibility of parts of this data and transferred it to Pangaea. So this was an interesting lesson for us, of course, because it allowed us to learn by doing what's missing. And, well, we can discuss that later on, what's there and what is not there. In general, I think we are in a relatively good situation in the moment. I repeat Jan's sentence, so fortunately we have the EOSC Eden and EOSC Fidelis project in place, because these projects, in particular Fidelis project, may serve as a nucleus for a future resilient trustworthy data repository network. And this, however, required some work still to be done. So we need to be prepared because, failure can happen anytime. I don't know if you know this publication. It's a few years old, but it showed some years ago already that a variety of data repositories disappeared, which have been listed at data, and the percentage of 6% is quite, it's a lot. So we have a network in place. There is a lot of technology already available, but we have to put things together and to prepare ourselves for the future, because repositories can fail, unfortunately, not only in the US. Thank you. Slides.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think that was a good presentation showing how you can bring what Jan and Hervé presented into practice in a repository. And we're getting a second example of that now from another discipline, from astronomy. So Mark Allen, the director of the Strasbourg Astronomical Data Center, will talk about the experiences in his repository.
Hi everyone, it's a real pleasure to be here. And we're talking about trust. I feel like we are trusted as the directors of data centers, of repositories. And I'm very pleased to give this talk on behalf of myself. I've been the director of what we call the CDS for the last 10 years, but I also draw on my successor, Caroline Beau, and predecessor Francoise, so we sort of represent 30 years of directorship of what we call the CDS. So CDS is Strasbourg Astronomical Data Center. In French, it's Centre de Données Astronomiques de Strasbourg, and we're a data center for what we call reference data in astronomy. We've been there for some 50 years, actually. And the mission has remained relatively the same. We collect useful data on astronomical objects. We improve them. We improve the data by some sort of critical evaluation and combination. And we distribute the results to the international astronomical community. And really importantly, we have embedded in our system people who are really doing research on the data itself. We're not a technical storage computing data center. We are a science-driven data center, and that, in order to stay there for 50 years, it's really required evolution. You can think in that time scale, there was the internet that came, there's all of these changes in technologies. So we've made the necessary evolutions to meet the scientific service needs of our community. And what we're really proud of is some of the innovations that we've done to ensure sustainability and to enable new types of science. And the science is changing, the technology is changing, and what we see, I think, now with EOSC, with all of the other things happening in the world, the landscape is really changing. We are not just astronomy serving our astronomy users. We are a part of the EOSC. We are part of this global open science movement. In France, we're a reference data center based in France, and we have the status of a French research infrastructure, which means we're included as part of the national strategy for research infrastructures, alongside of France's contribution to other large infrastructures, whether it be the European Southern Observatory or CERN or other scientific aspects. We see ourselves as part of the global astronomy data infrastructure. And so this is a kind of CDS-centric view of the world where there are other, of course, very large infrastructures in astronomy, space missions, observatories, and they have their proper archives and services that support all of that. There are also data centers, including ones in the United States, which we are really strongly interacting with. And there is a global coordination of data sharing in astronomy, and that comes under the label of Virtual Observatory. And there are organizations, for example, the International Virtual Observatory Alliance, that coordinates the standards that we employ in astronomy to make the data interoperable. So as part of this ecosystem, we also interact in European projects like the ESCAPE cluster, and various other aspects like the World Data System, the RDA, and at the French level, there's the National Initiative for Open Science called Research Data Gov, and of course we participate in EOSC. The kind of most privileged relationship we have, though, is with the academic journals in astronomy, because they publish, the papers and the data associated with those papers largely comes to the CDS to be put into our system. So we have an interface like this, where we provide the entry point to our services in terms of interactive web pages, but we also have many APIs. We have 3 different major services. It's a little bit Arabian Nights in terms of the name, Sinbad, Vizier, and Aladdin. And they have a significant amount of data in them. We're about a 4 petabyte data center. We have services to do with astronomical objects. Like the previous speaker, a lot of our data is tabular in form. We have a catalog service for the tabular data, and we have an extremely large, quickly growing image archive, which has about a petabyte of data in it. We make those services available to the community through these interactive services, but also through APIs and portals, and we distribute them via standards, we mint DOIs, and our data is harvested by different systems and becomes visible in many different places. It's fair through the use of international standards. The IVOA has an architecture of standards which is fairly complicated. It's an architecture which is about registry, about data access protocols, about formats and semantics, and we can sort of map that architecture directly onto FAIR, that things are findable, interoperable, accessible, and reusable. And these little blue dots that you don't need to see in detail, each one of those is a standard that's been worked on by the international community to help facilitate that part of the diagram to work. We have users that make queries at the level of about 5 million queries a day on the CDS services, both programmatically and interactively. But the users are not just the researchers, they're also the other infrastructures. The archive interface of the European Space Agency, of the European Southern Observatory, or of the NASA data archives integrate services from the CDS. For example, this image viewer that's integrated as part of the ESO archive. And we also contribute to education and public outreach. Because of the standardized way we make the data available, you can display the research data on the dome of a planetarium. We're really proud about that. So now to get to sort of the themes of this session, I really wanted to point out that we are research infrastructure that's science-driven, and in fact, we're about 38 people, equally scientists, software engineers, and we call them documentalists in France. It's kind of scientific expert data curators. And in fact, it's these people who contribute to the quality of the data in a way that's trusted by the community. So we have active researchers as part of our team, and they are visible in the community. We get community feedback directly from the people using our services. The trust also comes from the fact that we derive the data from refereed articles. And so we rely on this academic system of refereeing that the data we have has been assessed at some level, or at least the science associated with that data is assessed at some level. So that's qualified. And then the trust comes from playing our role, from engaging with the community so that we respond to their needs and that we interface with the different aspects in our community. At a more formalized level, we really appreciate the level of certification through the Core Trust Seal. So we've gone through this process twice. We've done the data seal of approval before that. And this helps us place the CDS in the context of trusted repositories, because researchers are assured that their research results will be managed well, because we have to comply with all of the criteria of the Core Trust Seal. Our funding authorities, they are also given confidence that we're going to make available in a fair way the data that comes from projects that they fund. And to the users, they know that an independent authority has assessed what we are doing. And so this is the last slide, a couple of lessons learned from these 50 years. In order to be sustainable, you need some stability. In France, and for our research infrastructure, that comes from this special labelization in France that puts us on the national French roadmap. But we are a national French research infrastructure that serves the international community. Okay, so that's a different aspect of that sovereignty. We are in charge of all of our data stack and our programs. So we think more of dependence in terms of sovereignty. We can rebuild our system because we have it in such a basic core state that if something changes like technology or politics or location, we can actually rebuild from scratch what we have. The active researchers and the data stewards have this extremely important role because they ensure the relevance of what we're doing. We're not just a place where you save the data on a disk somewhere. You make it usable. In fact, part of the credibility of that and part of the sustainability comes from our participation in defining the standards themselves. So we are part of the IVOA. And then interfacing now with the open science systems like EOSC, but also RDA, the World Data System, and in France, Research Data Govs. That brings more opportunities to talk to you, to get the ideas that you have, and to compare ourselves to you. But it also brings challenges. As you see in the, everyone is looking for funding, everyone is looking for how to grow your system using projects. And I mean, the future is bright, but we really have to keep working and keep being trustworthy. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, this works. Perfect. Okay, so we have 1/2 hour to go, and I would like to ask the 4 presenters to take a seat so we can go over to a panel discussion. And next to our 4 speakers, I would also like to call to the stage Anna Maria Höfler. And Anna Maria is Science Policy Coordinator at the Leibniz Information Center for Economics. And today she is here because she also represents the, and this is a mouthful, the Federation Build-Up Subgroup on integrating scientific data repositories into the EOSC Federation, of course. You're not seeing anything. Okay, then we need to, yeah, well, I thought that's not what you want. So maybe we can have the Slido up again and the Slido questions here, because I was very happy to see that we indeed have questions. But before we turn, does this work, guys? Yeah? Perfect. Before we... Okay, there we go. Mark and Robert, you talked about your own experiences in the repositories, and you come from fields where there has been a very long and intense international collaboration in both of your fields, I think. And I can imagine that for a repository that comes with challenges in the sense of marrying, on the one hand, the conviction of open science and being open and sharing, but on the other hand, also this element of data sovereignty. And I think in both of your fields, you also have researchers that are dependent on databases that are not within your control. So can you elaborate a little bit more on how you deal with these challenges, and also in terms of the data rescue activities, Robert, that you were talking about? Can you say a little bit more about why you do that and what that takes in practice? Because it's, I think, easier said than done to take data over from other databases and repositories.
Yeah, so actually this example was quite special because the dimension which was here on the table was well, something which we never experienced before. The rescue activity we actually performed under the umbrella of these larger data rescue activities was relatively narrow. So actually we were asked directly to well, preserve a number of data sets which well, seem to be of priority to the community as well as to the persons we could reach from the NOAA. That was the data archive which we preserved data for. The challenges were, of course, at the technological level, to, well, transfer it in a way that it fits to the requirements of the community. This was well possible because the fair status of these data sets was very high. So we had a very well-curated set of metadata descriptions in various formats available, as well as the data itself was in a format which we know very well. So that was relatively unproblematic. But on the other hand, it showed also, in particular, the workflow, that it is really a challenge to be prepared for that, right? So, because, I mean, these data sets all have a DOI, so what happens with these connections, with the links? So we had our own data sets and sometimes linked with these data sets. So we also preserved or tried to ingest some of the accompanying material, right, handbooks and so on, in order to preserve our internal links, not only the data. And in my point of view, the challenge in such data rescue activities is rather at the organizational level, right? So who decides what, when do you pull the button, and whom to ask to agree, because, well, if the personnel is not there anymore to ask, then it gets very tricky.
Do you want to continue, Mark?
Yeah, I can echo that it's a very sensitive topic, in fact, in astronomy. We've shared a lot, in fact, because astronomy is not such a big science. There have been, data centers in the United States that sort of take on some roles, and we've taken on various roles, and it's kind of complementary. And the current context kind of puts a new light on that, actually, because we see that things are a little bit more fragile than they have been. For example, we run mirrors in 7 different countries around the world, but we control that mirror. And in fact, our US partners have run mirrors in Europe. And now we're finding that situation is a bit more fragile, because what if that service actually starts to go away? And in fact, we've gotten ourselves ready to accommodate that sort of situation. But in fact, we can't really do anything until we're asked to by that partner. So it's very sensitive. But I think for community services, there's a lot of communication. So while there have in some fields, I think, already been some rescues needed, we are kind of watching that and ready to act. And we really want to learn from your experience, actually.
Thank you very much. Maybe let's try to move over to the bigger context of the EOSC Federation as the place the EOSC Federation is the place to go for data governance and data sovereignty. And then thinking about the repositories that are center stage in this session, Anna, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the fact that with the first wave of 30 nodes, I think we get around 60 repositories that are part of these 30 nodes into the Federation. What does that mean in terms of requirements for those repositories if they want to join, also related to that data governance aspect?
Well, I'd like to mention first that there is a guideline under development on onboarding policies for EOSC nodes in the course of the EOSC Federation build-up phase. And the reason why I say this is that there is an underlying logic, and the logic is that a repository always connects via a node. And this node takes over the responsibility for this repository. So the responsibility with respect to the users and also with respect to the EOSC Federation. So the nodes are the gateways of their communities into the EOSC Federation. So the repositories connect via the node. And now referring to this document is of course directed to the nodes, but the requirements in it might be reflected in the requirements that are defined by the nodes for the repositories that are going to be onboarded. And the requirements that are very likely to be reflected or to be relevant to the repositories are that repositories have to be fair, that they have to be operated on European infrastructures, meaning the infrastructure is physically located in an EU member state or associated country. It means that the repositories comply with the principles of the EOSC Federation, and that, well, they comply or agree to adhere to the technical specifications within the EOSC Federation. And of course, there's also a commitment with respect to sustainability. I think the document says at least 24 months. And also a certain technology readiness level has to be met. So it will always be a bilateral agreement between the repository and the node through which the repository is connected to the EOSC Federation. And I think we've seen throughout the presentations yesterday, today, and also specifically in this session, that the different communities have developed ways and procedures to ensure trustworthiness, to ensure data sovereignty, which then leads to trustworthiness. And I think this is an important part in order to ensure that EOSC is the research infrastructure in Europe that ensures data sovereignty.
So that means that in practice, the requirements that come from that direction will build on what we already have within the TDR community in terms of
I would assume that
Okay.
this relates definitely. Yes.
Thank you. Are there by now any questions in the audience? Is there anybody, because I see the questions on the Slido, but they come from you, so is there anybody who would like to ask that question themselves, or do you want me to read them out? Yes, go ahead. I will give you a microphone, because otherwise it doesn't work on the recording.
Yes, I can take the top one. If every country has a requirement to keep important data for research under sovereign control, how do we get to a division of labor inside EOSC?
So, is there anybody in the panel who would like to respond to that question? Which is not an easy one. Jan.
Always willing to stick my neck out towards a fellow Nordic. I'm not entirely sure what you mean with division of labor, though.
Well, not everybody needs to have all the data.
Okay, that not everybody needs to have all the data. That's what I thought. Right, we have like 43, 44 countries associated to Horizon Europe, the EOSC space. It would be convenient if not all 43 have to duplicate exactly the same data rescue operation. So my guess is you have to start treating EOSC, the EOSC Federation, as like one coherent space, and as a collective, through some mechanism that we per today probably do not have, identify whenever something like that happens, that you actually have A, a capability to do the data rescue as a collective, B, that you have some processes in place in order to actually divide the load, and C, I guess that division probably is something like, well, in certain cases there's going to be astronomy repositories that are the likely candidates to do something like that. In other cases it's going to be social sciences, there's going to be interaction with the research infrastructures, but you have to find some way to divide a load. It will not be easy. There are similar problems in Europe where it has been shown that dividing the load is a quite hard problem, but it could be done and probably should be done, at least if we want to save money as a collective.
Just to follow up on this one. So is duplication is, let's say, the reliability of the data. Does it have to go through repositories? Isn't it, after all, a matter of storage in the end? So you can move the problem from a repository where you store the authoritative copy and places like storage, as you said, across Europe, across the different nodes that are hosting copies of the data. So not necessarily a connection between repositories as such, which are more, formal publishing venues, places where I'm going to search and find stuff, but ensuring by multiplying the copies, the reliance of the data.
Robert or Hervé?
Depends on what you want and at what level you want the resilience, right? If you just want to have a copy, a backup, and you don't care if it's going to have a lot of effort in order to have a restore, right? The restore point objective, then just a disk backup ought to be fine. If you want to have instant reusability, it's going to be different. Parallel with the seed vault in Spitsbergen, right? That's the backup seed vault for national seed vaults. If you want to retrieve your backup from there, you have to fly to a pretty remote place, take a snow scooter, and do some more effort before you can retrieve that, right?
Yeah, and I think we need to take care that the data remains in the in the curated environment, right? So just having copies does not. It helps, but it is not a final solution. So if we have multiple copies, data rescue also means that we have to bring it back into an environment where we have the data curated, so to be prepared if requirements of the scientific community with respect to whatever file formats also are changed. So that's, I think, very important.
Quick, because we have more questions in the room.
I'd like to add to your comment. Yes, that's really important to get that back into a curated environment, because the issue of data provenance is very important, meaning that there's transparency with respect to where is the data, who has produced it, who has used it for what purposes, who has modified the data in which way. And this also has to be documented in some way in order to have robust data sets and robust data. And this, again, pays into transparency and trustworthiness and data sovereignty in the end.
Thank you for the addition. Klaus.
Yeah, I just want to add that we have not yet discussed in detail the situation of to what extent the Federation should take responsibility for data rescue. Actually, it does not align with our current policies, because we consider the EOSC Federation to be a system of systems. And each of the systems which are part of the system of systems keeps complete control and independence. They can keep their policies, can keep everything as they have established over the past years, and we do not interfere with that. If we now take as a federation responsibility for backups, that would be a different approach, because we would then interfere with their policies, with their independency. And I'm not sure if we want to do that, because the federation is, again, the system of systems, connecting the existing systems, but leaves them independent from one another, and particularly independent from the federation. So we would need a completely different governance structure in case we had to take care of backup services to nodes, repositories connected to the federation. And again, we haven't discussed that in full detail. I just want to avoid that through expectations, there is too much pressure on what the EOSC Association and the Federation can deliver.
That was a bit of expectation management. Thank you, Klaus. Jan?
So it is what it is at the moment. But from my perspective, I'm looking years ahead into the future and assuming we will have an EOSC Federation, and that gives us a framework to actually have these types of discussions.
Okay. sometime in the future, but let's stay in the present. And there is one question that has been liked a couple of times, and that is also, I think, related to what was clear from the first two presentations, that nothing is binary in this world. So it is quite complicated for a repository to know when am I trustworthy and who is going to define that trustworthiness. Is it me, myself, by saying, look at me, how good I am, or do I need to look at others to do that? And is there some kind of a minimum level that makes me enter that trustworthiness world? Hervé, could you enlighten us? What minimum criteria should the repository fulfill to be considered trustworthy?
We've heard multiple stories, but there are multiple authorities here. So if you want to publish your Horizon Europe outputs, then the Commission has got certain expectations. The EOSC handbook presents a certain number of expectations, which includes some internal criteria, but also co-reliance on accepting things like the Cortra seal, for instance. There is a difference between having an authority and having criteria and having an assessment and then being able to produce the transparent information to provide information for that. One global definition of either sovereignty or trust is not going to miraculously make that a thing, which is why the big conversation on FIDLS is about defining the contexts. Yeah, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. There are many needs that can be met by retention and backup, but there are many needs that cannot be met without active long-term preservation of resources for a wider community. So the Cortra seal would expect active preservation as a minimum. I don't think that's necessary for everything, but it's certainly something. I think transparency of expectations and transparency of service are where the work we're doing at the moment seeks to work out where they meet in the middle. I will say that the EOSC Federation might not be delivering this, but there are a larger and larger number of list of things which I'm seeing on EOSC diagrams which repositories are miraculously going to make true with limited resources.
Talking about resources, there's a question about, oh, you wanted to follow up on that,
Oh,
Mark?
I just wanted to mention about, carrots and sticks with certification.
Yeah.
Cortra seal, I mean, it's one of the authorities. I think if we have a few authorities that are, have an interest in certification, that's great. If we had 100 of them, that would be difficult, impossible. But Cortra seal, just to say, Cortra seal is a kind of certification at, by our peers. Actually, we, as part of the WDS and part of Cortra seal, we're actually involved in the assessment of others. And I find this a really interesting and useful configuration because you participate in the Cortra seal itself and you are sort of assessed by the Cortra seal independently, and you have a sort of say in the level of certification that is relevant for your domain. If it was completely top down with a stick, I'm not sure that we would get the same sort of encouragement to improve our services like we have sort of done in response to Cortra seal criteria. Some of those criteria are not always directly relevant, but by participating, you at least have a say in it.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. I think that makes it really useful to think about both authority and context, because there are circumstances, particularly the protection of individual personal data, where there should be absolutely binary black and white expectations of what can or can't be delivered, certainly in terms of security, people's expectations and all the rest of it. But for the rest of it, and talking about peers, yes, I think something that's come up repeatedly, including on Fair Impact, which Ingrid was kind of critical in, was this idea of associating both assessment but also assistance. Because I know that our Cortra seal, more than anything else, was a route to internal discussions and improvements that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Are there any more questions from the room? No? There are two questions in the slide related to the data rescue that we were talking about. The first one is, how do you ensure data integrity when migrating data in large-scale data rescue actions? Can users have trust in the integrity of the rescued data? Robert or Mark, can you provide an answer to that question, or anybody else?
I try. So it depends on how many time you have. That's it's essential, and it also depends on how well prepared the data repository or the data is actually to be rescued. And this is for me also an important lesson of the whole exercises we had, because we can prepare to be rescued. We should not think always from the perspective of those who rescue others, but we also could come into the situation too, that we have to be rescued, and this can be prepared. So we can prepare data, the technologies are there, we can prepare data as a package that we want it to be, right? And then it of course depends on the repository, if it is able to mimic what the original repository was doing. There will certainly be a loss sometimes, but yeah, not necessarily. It depends on the preparation and time.
Then the final question, who pays for this all? So I know that both in Germany and then probably also in Norway there is activity on a more national scale to take care of that. I know that there is a funding program also open from DFG. So that money is coming from the national level, I imagine? You can trace it in the state budget. Okay, that's a clear answer. Hervé.
But there's also a huge amount of invisible and uncosted individual effort by people who really care about this stuff as well. I think that's an important thing to remember, that a lot of these problems are being solved by people with very few resources but quite a lot of commitment. So.
On a voluntary basis, yes, for sure. That's what a lot of our infrastructures thrive on, by the way. Jan.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. There was an exercise in Norway around data sharing, long-term storage of data, etc., who should pay for that. And the world was divided up in a couple of classes, and there was a class that they said long-term preservation of data that was put on in the same box effectively as long-term preservation of Norwegian culture, which is National Library, hence the state pays. And if you take that as a kind of a starting point, there will always be a community who is interested in that the data is rescued. Right? Sometimes it is very easily to attribute that to a particular community, and you could argue maybe that community should pay. Other times it's in the general society's interest that something is not lost. If we would have the opportunity to save the Buddhas in Afghanistan for the future, would we have paid for that? And the answer is probably yes.
I'm just going to say that an exit strategy for a digital object as bits is not the same thing as a succession plan for a service made of people and expertise. And I think we need to make sure that both of those are considered. Just because you can grab the bits doesn't mean you can continue to deliver that same level of service.
And the bottom line is that many repositories are struggling because a lot of this structural work is based on incidental funding. So we have a world to win there when we talk about sustainability, sovereignty, etc., etc. If there are no more urgent questions from the room, then I think we are running towards the end of the session, but also towards the end of a long day, already the second day, so I think you long to leave this room. But we're not going before, well, I think concluding that repositories, trustworthy digital repositories, have a pivotal role to play within the EOSC Federation. We need to figure out how that can exactly work, what the requirements are, and even more basic, we need to figure out let's say, all the definitions of the repositories, the databases, the governance, all of that, what we are really talking about, and making sure that we speak the same language. With that, I would like to thank our excellent speakers, and I hope you give them a big round of applause. And I wish you a relaxing evening. Thank you.